Auschwitz-Birkenau, 1944. A freight train slows on the ramp. Doors are forced open. Inside, hundreds of people who have traveled for days without food, without water, without knowing where they are going. On the platform stands a man in an immaculate SS uniform, boots polished, gloves white. He is calm. Some survivors would later say he was even cheerful, that he whistled opera as he worked. With a small flick of his riding crop, left or right, he decides who lives a little longer and who walks straight to the gas chambers within the hour. His name is Josef Mengele. The prisoners who survived him would give him a name of their own, the Angel of Death. In the space of about 20 months, Mengele performed selections on this platform more often than almost any other doctor at Auschwitz. Survivors remembered his white gloves, his quiet voice, the strange gentleness in his manner that made the horror somehow worse, a courtesy extended to people he was about to send to die. But the platform was only the beginning of what he did at Auschwitz. Behind the selections lay a second, more secret project, medical experiments on living human beings, conducted in the name of science, that would make his name one of the most infamous in modern history. This is the story of how a promising young doctor became a mass murderer, and how, for 34 years after the war ended, he was never caught. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, a small town in Bavaria, the eldest son of a wealthy manufacturer of farm machinery. He grew up comfortable, intelligent, and ambitious, the kind of student professors remembered. He studied philosophy in Munich before turning to medicine and, separately, to physical anthropology, a field then consumed with classifying human beings by racial type. In 1935, he earned a doctorate in anthropology for a study on the jaw structure of different population groups. 3 years later, in 1938, he completed a second doctorate, this time in medicine, joined the Nazi Party, and was accepted into the SS. This was not unusual for the time. Nazi Germany had transformed entire branches of medicine and anthropology into instruments of racial ideology, and ambitious young scientists who shared, or were willing to perform, those beliefs found rapid advancement. Mengele worked for a time under Otto von Verschuer, a leading geneticist obsessed with the study of twins as a way to separate the effects of heredity from environment. It was an interest Mengele would carry with him for the rest of his life, and weaponize in ways Verschuer's academic research never could. When war began, Mengele served as a medical officer with a Waffen SS unit on the Eastern Front. He was decorated for bravery and wounded in combat in 1942, leaving him unfit for further frontline service. He recovered, and in May 1943, the SS gave him a new posting, chief physician of the Roma family camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, soon expanded to broader medical authority across the camp complex. He was 32 years old. He had just been handed access to an almost limitless supply of human beings, with no oversight, no consequences, and a war that gave him cover for whatever he chose to call research. When Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the camp was already a machine for mass murder, processing thousands of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and other prisoners deported from across occupied Europe. Camp doctors had two official duties under the SS system: supervise the health of personnel, and perform selections, deciding, often within seconds, which new arrivals would be sent to forced labor and which would be murdered immediately in the gas chambers. Most SS doctors found the duty distasteful and rotated it among themselves. Mengele was different. Survivors and fellow prisoners who worked as forced medical assistants described him as unusually willing, even eager, to take ramp duty, sometimes volunteering for shifts that were not his own. He cultivated a particular manner, soft-spoken, courteous, almost paternal. He would ask mothers the ages of their children. He gave out sweets to frightened young arrivals before separating them from their parents. Survivors recall the disorientation of being treated kindly by the man who, minutes later, sent their families to die. This contradiction was not an accident of personality. It was effective. A calm, reassuring doctor caused less panic on the ramp than a shouting guard, which made the machinery of selection run faster and with less resistance. Mengele understood this, and used it. Beyond the ramp, Mengele held complete authority over which prisoners would be pulled aside, not for the gas chambers, but for something else. He was looking for specific subjects: twins, dwarfs, people with mismatched eye colors, people with physical abnormalities of every kind. When he found them, he did not send them to the work details. He sent them to his laboratory. Of everything Mengele did at Auschwitz, his experiments on twins are the most documented and the most studied. Drawing on his earlier academic interest in twin research as a tool for separating nature from environment, Mengele turned Auschwitz into what he treated as an unrestricted laboratory. Whenever twins arrived on a transport, Mengele's assistants were instructed to pull them from the line immediately, regardless of age. Surviving accounts describe announcements made directly on the platform: "Twins, step forward." Some parents, not understanding what awaited their children either way, believed this meant their children would be spared. The twins selected, historians estimate around 1,500 sets, some 3,000 children in total, were housed separately, given marginally better food and clothing than other prisoners, and subjected to constant measurement, comparison, and invasive procedures. Mengele and his assistants measured every part of their bodies, drew blood repeatedly, sometimes from both twins simultaneously to compare results, performed spinal taps without anesthesia, and in some cases injected one twin with diseases or chemical substances to observe the effect, then compared the results against the untouched sibling. When one twin died, whether from the experiments, from disease, or from the conditions of the camp, Mengele frequently ordered the other twin to be killed immediately by lethal injection so that comparative autopsies could be performed on both bodies at once. Eva Moses Kor, who survived Auschwitz with her twin sister Miriam, became one of the most prominent voices documenting what was done to the children Mengele studied. She and her sister endured years of procedures whose purpose was never explained to them. Miriam's kidneys, permanently damaged by an injection given in the camp, eventually failed decades later, in 1993, leading to her death, a delayed casualty of an experiment performed half a century earlier. Of the roughly 3,000 children pulled into Mengele's twin studies, only an estimated 200 are believed to have survived the war. Twins were Mengele's signature obsession, but they were far from his only subjects. He took a particular interest in dwarfism and other forms of skeletal abnormality, assembling a small group of prisoners with dwarfism, including, famously, a family of 7 members known as the Auschwitz family, Hungarian Jewish performers, for measurement and study. Unusually, the Auschwitz family survived the war, in part because Mengele valued them as research subjects he did not want to lose. He was fascinated by heterochromia, people born with 2 different colored eyes, and by any prisoner with unusual pigmentation. In pursuit of understanding eye color, he had chemical dyes injected directly into the eyes of children, an excruciating procedure that in several documented cases caused blindness or death. After some of these deaths, the eyes were removed and sent to colleagues for further study. Roma and Sinti children held in the family camp under Mengele's direct authority were subjected to a similar range of procedures: blood draws, injections, surgeries without medical necessity, and in some cases deliberate infection with diseases such as typhus or tuberculosis, simply to observe the course of the illness in a controlled population that no one outside the camp would ever be able to account for. Mengele also took part in the broader program of forced sterilization experiments conducted at Auschwitz, testing methods, including chemical injections and X-ray exposure, intended to sterilize large populations cheaply and without their knowledge, should the regime ever need to apply the technique on a mass scale outside the camps. None of this was concealed from his superiors. Mengele corresponded regularly with academic colleagues in Berlin, including his former mentor Otto von Verschuer, sending tissue samples, blood, and research notes back to institutes in the German capital, places that, in theory, operated under the normal standards of scientific inquiry, and that accepted material harvested through torture and murder without apparent objection. By January 1945, the Soviet Red Army was advancing rapidly through occupied Poland, and the SS began evaluating Auschwitz, destroying records, and marching surviving prisoners west in what became known as the Death Marches. Mengele left the camp on January 17, 1945, just days before Soviet forces liberated what remained of Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27. He did not flee in panic. He left in an orderly fashion, with paperwork, transferring first to other camps and medical postings as the front collapsed around him. By the war's end in May 1945, Mengele was one of millions of German soldiers in American-controlled territory, and, critically, one whose SS tattoo, the identifying mark most SS members carried, was absent, either never applied or already altered. He was briefly held in American POW camps, processed, and, astonishingly, given what awaited discovery, released. At the time, the scale of what had happened inside the camp medical blocks was not yet understood by Allied screening officers working through millions of prisoners. Mengele's name was not yet associated with mass murder in any system designed to flag him. He spent the next several years working under a false identity as a farmhand near Rosenheim, Bavaria, hidden, knowingly or not, by local families, while his own family's manufacturing business in Günzburg continued operating and, evidence later showed, helped fund his survival and eventual escape. By 1949, as European nations began assembling formal investigations into Nazi war crimes, and as former camp prisoners began identifying men they remembered from the ramps, Mengele's window for staying safely in Germany was closing. He made the decision that would define the rest of his life, to leave Europe entirely. In 1949, Mengele traveled to Genoa, Italy, and from there sailed for Argentina using a passport under his own name, financed by his family. He was one of thousands of former Nazis who escaped Europe through what later became known as the Radlands, escape networks that exploited post-war chaos, sympathetic clergy and officials, and the willingness of certain South American governments to accept German immigrants without close scrutiny of their wartime record. In Buenos Aires, under Argentine President Juan Perón's government, Mengele lived for years under his own name, operating as a businessman with support from his family's company back in Germany and from a network of expatriate Nazi sympathizers. For a time, he felt secure enough to travel back to Europe and even remarry within the extended Mengele family circle. The ground began shifting beneath him after 1958, when West Germany issued an arrest warrant, and especially after 1960. When Israeli intelligence agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires and spirited him to Israel for trial, an operation that sent a clear signal to every former Nazi hiding in South America that no distance was truly safe. Mengele fled Argentina for Paraguay, and later settled in Brazil, moving between rural properties near Sao Paulo under assumed names, most famously Wolfgang Gerhard, borrowed from a real Austrian Nazi sympathizer who had died, with the connivance of a Hungarian-Brazilian couple, the Stammers, who sheltered him for years. Mossad agents, fresh from the success of the Eichmann operation, actively searched for Mengele through the 1960s. By some accounts, they came close, surveilling properties, following leads from Mengele's own family correspondence, but a capture operation was never executed, whether from missed opportunity, insufficient certainty of his location, or shifting intelligence priorities. West Germany's official extradition requests went unanswered by uncooperative regimes. The most wanted Nazi fugitive in the world continued living, quietly, undiscovered, year after year. On February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele went swimming in the ocean at Bertioga, on the coast of Brazil. He suffered a stroke in the water and drowned. He was 67 years old. The Brazilian couple who had sheltered him for his final years buried him under the name on his false papers, Wolfgang Gerhard. For 6 more years, the world's most wanted Nazi war criminal remained, officially, simply dead, under someone else's name, in someone else's grave, his real fate unknown to the investigators, governments, and survivors still searching for him. The truth surfaced in 1985, when West German and Brazilian authorities, acting on information from the Bossert family, who had also helped shelter Mengele, exhumed the grave-marked Wolfgang Gerhard. Forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow led an international team that examined the skeletal remains and compared them against Mengele's known medical and dental records, along with family photographs. The physical evidence strongly matched. In 1992, DNA testing using material from Mengele's living son provided definitive confirmation. The bones in that Brazilian grave belonged to Josef Mengele. He had died free. He had never stood trial. He had never been forced to answer, in any courtroom, for the deaths of the twins, the children blinded by dye injected into their eyes, the thousands sent to the gas chambers with a flick of his wrist on the Auschwitz ramp. Of all the senior SS doctors who served at Auschwitz, Mengele evaded justice longer and more completely than almost any other. Eva Moses Kor, the twin survivor, spent decades afterward giving testimony, building Holocaust education programs, and confronting former Nazi perpetrators directly, including, in a widely covered 2015 case, expressing forgiveness toward a former Auschwitz guard on trial in Germany, a position that drew controversy even among fellow survivors. She died in 2019, having outlived the man who experimented on her by 40 years. Today, Mengele's name endures as shorthand for the Union of Medical Authority and total moral collapse, a reminder that the worst atrocities of the 20th century were not committed only by ideologues with guns, but by men in white coats and clean gloves, working with patience, method, and an unshakable conviction that they were conducting science. He was never punished. The record of what he did remains.